This is the Vanguard podcast. I'm Gavin.
And I'm Zac.
And today we're so thrilled to welcome to the program Marianne Williamson, author, activist, former presidential candidate, and host of the Marianne Williamson podcast. How are you doing today, Marianne?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, we're so excited to speak with you today. We're very grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Super excited to speak to you today, Marianne. I guess a good question to start with, one that I've been wanting to ask you for a while, is I was a big fan of your campaign for president. And one of the suggestions that I thought that you brought to the table that was just really underappreciated was that of creating a Department of Peace. Obviously, the United States still has a tremendous influence on the world stage, and there's no reason that influence can't be used for good means, for diplomatic means, rather than militaristic or imperialist means. As you said in your campaign so beautifully, peace building is both preferable to and less costly than war. We spend more money on our military than the next 9 militaries in the world. And I think that overall your campaign had some of the best, most creative approaches to talking about foreign policy, even more so than other candidates that were running that also made foreign policy a big part of their campaign. I think yours was just, so underrated. And foreign policy is obviously the most neglected and usually underreported on aspect of a presidential agenda. So how do you think the anti-war movement stands under a Biden presidency? And also, what do you think we can do to meaningfully resist these realities as activist citizens, especially in an age of increased drone warfare, the horrors of which are obviously less visible to your average American than usually wartime is? Obviously, during the Vietnam War or even the Iraq War, the anti-war movement was so much more robust.
Absolutely. You know, a young man about you guys' age said to me once, one of my events, he said, "Miss Williamson, you're just an aging hippie." He said, "You guys were just all sex, drugs, and rock and roll." And I remember responding, that was just part of the day. The rest of the day, we stopped a war. What have you done? We took on the military-industrial complex. We protested the war in Vietnam. So you're right. When I was younger, there was a ban the bomb. There was a lot of talk not only about U.S. military, certainly involvement in Vietnam. And remember, a lot of that had to do with the fact that there was a draft then. Yeah. So it wasn't just other people. It was our brothers, our sons, our friends, our loved ones. That was a large part of it. And also all of the conversation about the nuclear industry, ban the bomb. And what has happened now is such a fatigue has set in on such a deep level that you hear some bitching and moaning and complaining about the military-industrial complex, but no serious resistance to it beyond what you mentioned in the presidential campaign. I thought it was extraordinary how little conversation there was about foreign policy, although I'm also not surprised because I see how the system really operates now. And I see what they did to Tulsi and I see what they did to me, because to take on the military-industrial complex, just like taking on Big Pharma or any of these other specific entities that are making billion-dollar profits off humans suffering, is to go beyond the pre-prescribed conversation that the political elite has said we will allow in. You know, they say you have choice, but how much choice do you really have when they are so adamant about nullifying the voice of anyone who represents any kind of serious alternative to what they are talking about? Bernie also, of course, talked about Yemen, which is an extremely important issue. But for the most part, it was amazing when you saw the debate stage, et cetera. There were no questions about it whatsoever. So I had heard Dennis Kucinich years ago, a congressman, I hope you know who he is, talking about the Department of Peace. And you mentioned earlier, when you were asking the question, you talked about diplomatic efforts. We now have a defense budget of somewhere around, $780 billion. Our State Department budget is $40 billion. So that right there tells you. Now, we all know what's going on here. They make it sound complicated, but it's really simple. There's money to be made on war. The problem is, there are billions of dollars to be made off for a war economy, 53 cents of every dollar spent on defense-related expenditures. But what about your chance and the chance of my great-grandchildren and your grandchildren to actually live on this earth if we continue with the trajectory that we're on? Now, this is actually not rocket science. There are ways to wage peace, just as there are ways to wage war. You know, it used to be decades ago, people believed in a more allopathic model of health and healing. You didn't really feel you were responsible for taking care of your body. You didn't really feel you were responsible for lifestyle or exercise choices that led to health, creating good health. You just hoped you didn't get sick. And then if you did get sick, you went to the doctor and hoped that there would be some external remedy that would suppress or eradicate the symptom. We transitioned. A lot of that transition into a more holistic model had to do with the AIDS crisis, actually, historically. But people began to realize you can't just wait till you get sick. You have to consciously, proactively cultivate health. There are things you do to cultivate health through diet, through exercise, through lifestyle, etc. And so there was an understanding that health is not the absence of sickness. Sickness is the absence of health. As we move into the 21st century, move more deeply, we're already in it. In every field except politics, there's the realization of a more holistic, integrative, whole person paradigm that is necessary in order to actually solve problems. War is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. So if you continue to act in ways that make violence almost inevitable, of course, there will be eruption of violence. And then what we have in the United States today is that's okay, basically, because there's so much money to be made. We have to change our thinking. How do you create peace? There are 4 elements which are factors that, when present, statistically indicate there will be a greater incidence of peace and a lower incidence of violence. Number 1, expansion of economic opportunities for women. Number 2, an expansion of educational opportunities for children. Number 3, the reduction of violence against women. And number 4, the amelioration of unnecessary human despair. So that's where we should be putting money. And also, I don't know if you read the book by Ronan Farrow called War on Peace. It also really tracks. I'm sorry. Yeah, the War on Peace. That really tracks how over the last few decades, the State Department has been released from its more traditional role and placed more at the service of military options and at the service also of whatever huge multinational corporations want. For instance, Trump's first Secretary of State had been the CEO of Exxon, yep. And how even now, with the war with the United States for the sake of an arms deal, supporting, giving aerial support to the war in Yemen that is starving tens of thousands, including children, it's worth noting that Pompeo's response when he was asked how the United States could do something so profoundly immoral, how our foreign policy could be so craven that we were willing for blood money to participate in aerial support, without which the Crown Prince would not be able to prosecute that war. Pompeo's response was, sometimes you can have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values, which means you've surrendered your values. So this is the conversation that has to begin. We can't just fight the military-industrial complex. We have to understand why, and a change from a war economy to a peace economy. Now, when people say, "Oh, but there's so much money to be made," you've got a lot of people who work for the military-industrial complex. And by the way, I'm not saying there should be no strong military, but we spend hundreds of billions of dollars above and beyond what our military leaders actually say that we need. Right? And we now know that even here in the United States, investment in infrastructure, investment in education, investment in things that actually help people live better lives actually produces more monetary success than it does a war economy. And that war economy can be transitioned. Just like we can transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy, we can transition from a war economy to a peace economy. And I think that the left needs to be very careful and acknowledge that there are thousands of people whose jobs are part of this transition. Yeah. And there should be no one left behind in that transition. And I think sometimes we are perceived as not caring about things like that, and we should care. And Absolutely. That transition should be careful.
Absolutely. I think that you bring so many, what I would consider, and I think to many Americans, many Americans, they want peace. They want to be done with these wars. I mean, people voted for Barack Obama in 2008 with the hope that he would get us out of the wars. And I think to some extent, there were a lot of Trump voters who cast a vote for Donald Trump because they thought that he would get people out of the war. And, one of the things that struck me during your campaign was, how many of these things that I would consider, obvious, necessary proposals were greeted with, such smears. It seems that anytime that anybody, particularly a woman candidate, thought to challenge the military-industrial complex, there were smears against you and Tulsi Gabbard, who you mentioned early. And, from many prominent Democrats, a party that brands itself as a party of women, resorting to what seemed like, frankly, blatantly sexist attempts to undermine your credibility, your intelligence, and your ability to lead by, claiming that you were some, hokey, kooky woman who wanted peace, which is an impossibility. Like, how could we ever have that? I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that experience, what that was like to be the focal point of smears from a party that you thought was your own, and also if that changed your political position at all and how you felt about the Democratic Party?
On a personal level, it was very painful. And it was also surprising because I naively thought that our side didn't act that way. I had mentioned things like Latin America. I had mentioned certain things on the debate stage, which clearly made somebody say, in a very high position, say, get that woman off the stage. Tulsi herself said to me later, she said, you and I, it wasn't that we saw things that other candidates didn't see, but we were willing to look at the people and say, we see you. So within 3 days, of course, the smears began. And the talking points were so obviously consciously drawn, dangerous, crazy. It was almost like something out of the Middle Ages or something. She's dangerous, she's crazy, she's a grifter, she's anti-medicine, she's anti-science. But also, I think it's worth noting how easily duped people were. I mean, that was, you really got to see how easy it is to make a joke of someone. And of course, this is how that character assassinates. Very interesting. The strategy is not to shut someone up. The strategy is just to make her appear in a way that the pseudo-sophisticates would think, oh, well, I'm too cool, I'm too smart to listen to her. They see 1 or 2 tweets or 1 or 2 planted articles or 1 or 2 people who know nothing about my work, people writing about my books who clearly have never read my books, talking about my work with AIDS patients who clearly were not there. So yes, on a personal level, it hurt, but then on another hand, I should have fought back in ways that I was sort of advised not to. I think the most important thing, though, is not anyone's personal story, including my own. What is important, however, is that we learn the lessons from that we learn how vicious the elite establishment is about protecting its turf. And they feel that their turf is really the whatever the conversation is going to be. And you cannot go to the right, you cannot go to the left, and you cannot go above, and you cannot go below it. That's number one. But also, I think that many people, since I've seen so many people talking about this, wow, we slept on Marianne Williamson, blah, blah, blah. I hope that people are asking themselves, it's not about me personally, but ask themselves, would you have thought you were a person so easily taken off the track, taken off boy, they didn't have a hard time. That's what was so amazing. That's number one. And number two, would it have been so easy had I been a man? I didn't have any experience as elected official, neither did Andrew Yang. He's a businessman. Well, actually, I've had my own share of experience. So I think there are things for people to look at. My own, as a person, it's something I went through, something I learned from, but this is much bigger than any one person. And what you see now, the continuation of this is what's important now. That was then, this is now. And what you're seeing now, as you clearly are aware, is how progressives are being treated right now. We know what happened to me and Tulsi. Okay, we know what happened to Bernie. We know that progressives were sidelined in the Biden campaign. We know that progressives, for the most part, were left out of the convention. And right now, as we speak, I am one of those people who felt very strongly about electing Biden because I do believe there was a neo-fascist in the White House, still is for a few days. I did believe that the existential imperative was to break the free fall of democracy that he represented. But I didn't do so naive about what the neoliberal establishment represents. And I, like many people, am pretty much holding my breath to see what these appointments are going to be. I'm very impressed by AOC and others who are holding a line. When people say, wait until the dust settles, that's absurd. Once the dust settles, that means the corporatists have already been appointed and they will hear us out. Hear us out. No. We want to be more than listened to. I have a friend who heads a large nonprofit, anti-hunger and anti-poverty nonprofit, who said something to me years ago that I never forgot. I asked him the difference between the Obama administration and the Bush administration. And his response was very chilling. It was, the Obama administration returns our calls.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the two-party establishment and you talked about waiting for the dust to settle, like so many of the leaders of the progressive left have kind of been doing, you were out there, you definitely didn't wait for the dust to settle. And I think that was probably most evidenced by your presence at the People's Convention, which was a couple of months ago. I thought that your speech was one of the absolute highlights of the convention, and your presence there as a past Democratic Party, I think really gave the People's Party a lot of clout and made people pay more attention to them. We talk about the subject a lot on here, the Vanguard, how the best way to get a progressive in the White House would be as soon as possible, and whether it would be more effective to try to run again like Bernie did as a Democrat and like you did, knowing that once again they're going to put their thumbs on the scale and mess around behind the scenes and screw with democracy. You accurately described what happened to Bernie as a coup. I thought that was very accurate back when that went down.
And courageous to say, frankly.
Yeah.
What did you say, Zach?
Oh, I said, and courageous to say. A lot of people resisted the urge to defending Bernie Sanders. I just wanted to comment.
Funny because as soon as I tweeted that, I got a phone call from the Bernie campaign asking me to take it down.
Yeah, that sounds like Bernie.
Well, yeah,
Who knows that came from him?
Oh, sure. I meant sounds like
I don't think Bernie Sanders was personally tracking my tweets that night, but
sure.
And we support Movement for a People's Party pretty heavily here. Again, we're a huge fan of your speech there, and we think that they have somewhat exciting potential when it comes to the next presidential election. Hopefully, when it comes to third parties, obviously I've been on the voting green for a while. That's not really getting us the results we need. What's your thinking on this strategically as far as the People's Party or third parties go? And if you ever made another run for office, would you consider running as a People's Party candidate?
I feel the same conflict and ambivalence and disturbance in my heart that I think many, many people feel. I have great respect for Nick Brana. I think he's really great. I have great respect for what he's doing, and I think it's important. So that's that's absolutely true for me. It's also true that 87,000 votes that Jill Stein got put Trump in the White House. And that's no small thing either. I understand all of the arguments, and all of those arguments live in me. Those arguments about how Obama's presidency paved the way, neoliberalism paved the way for Trump, how if the neoliberal trajectory is simply reformed, and we see the same thing happening now that happened before with the neoliberals, that I do believe we will be in big trouble in 22 and in 24. I personally, and I think some of this might have to do with my age, unlike you, I have, because of simply the longer time that I've been on this earth, I have a historical memory of a time when the Democrats did indisputably stand for the working people of America. I saw the slide. I was there for it. I saw what happened when Clinton formed the Democratic Leadership Council, et cetera. I feel sort of like, I know this sounds almost like a silly image, but it's not. I feel like a woman in a marriage, not that they're married to me. The Democratic Party made it very clear. Gay is not to hate. There's a Yiddish expression, gay is not to hate. They don't care. They don't care. But I'm still tied to the marriage, and I can't leave the marriage unless and until I feel I've done everything possible. And so I'm right now standing with the AOC type of crowd. Jamal Bowman is there now, Mondaire Jones, Cori Bush. I have a lot of faith, certainly in their intention. I'm very disturbed that I cannot believe that they reelected Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, that was a question that I actually wanted to ask you about. Do you have a comment on that? Nobody even ran against her.
Any business that rewarded failure the way the Democratic Party does would not long survive. When Newt Gingrich was the Republican Speaker of the House and they lost, he resigned the next day. You know, a lot of this, I think, has to do with the fact that a lot of Republicans come from the private sector. More so, and they certainly have a more free market private sector perspective.
That's a good point.
Although it's not really free market, but you understand what I'm saying.
Sure.
They know in the private sector that if something's not working on Wednesday, you have to change it by Friday or the company goes down. The Democrats have more of it didn't work on Wednesday, but we'll just throw some more money at it and maybe that'll fix it by Friday. And if by Monday it's obvious it's still not working, I don't know what their excuse is for doing it anyway. And we're not allowed to have the conversation about, for instance, Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer is just given that role again, where he's basically calling the shots for the Democratic senatorial campaign.
After the Jamie Harrison race, after
Not
the
just Jamie Harrison, even more Charles Booker and
Amy McGrath. Yeah, I just meant the money that was wasted on that campaign.
Not just the money, but what makes them think that a New York senator knows what Kentuckyites want? So he had one good campaign commercial with Amy McGrath and next to her airplane. And based on that one TV commercial raised what, $100 million? And she ultimately lost by 10 percentage points, barely better than Marquita Bradshaw in Tennessee, who hardly had anything.
I think it was more than 10. I think it was like 20 or 30 or something. Yes,
and Kentuckyites made it clear where the energy was. The energy was with Charles Booker. Now, I was a Breuer fan, so but I could see that Booker, they were both the progressives, and I could see that Booker had the energy. The audacity when the Kentuckyites were saying, we got the guy, and the energy and the youth, and he comes in, well, we'll pour more money behind her, and he is given the job again. And you're not even allowed to have the conversation. It's like you and I, we're up in the attic or in the garage. We're saying it because we're allowed to say it. It's
It looks like, just like corruption, like controlled, opposition, right? I think that it makes people believe that they're just setting goalposts so that they can constantly fundraise off failure.
It's if it's a sign, which I know many people right now would be saying, open your eyes, Marianne, it clearly is. If it's a sign of how things will go over the next year or so, that's terrible for the Democratic Party and it's terrible for America.
Yeah, totally. Well, I wanted to kind of remind the audience, anyone that's listening, about one of the most excellent aspects of your campaign, and that was your policy and commitment to the policy of reparations. I think a lot of lefty voters during the primary really started to take you seriously when they heard you speak about your reparations policy. And for me specifically, I remember when you went on Dave Rubin's show and basically had to explain to him like a school teacher why the policy would be so necessary, or why it's something that people are clearly prescribing as an answer to obviously our history of racial injustice in this country. I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that part of your campaign and what you think you accomplished specifically by having conversations with people like Dave Rubin on the subject matter.
I wrote a book that was published in the late 90s called Healing the Soul of America. And in order to prepare for that book, I actually hired an American history teacher to accompany my journey through various books. And it wasn't, I mean, I was a standard liberal on the issue of race, but it wasn't until my studies for that book that my eyes were opened at a deeper level to everything that had happened in this country since 1619. The almost 250 years of slavery that were then followed by, except for 12 years of Reconstruction, what is essentially another 100 years of domestic terrorism. I mean, what do you call Ku Klux Klan and lynchings, et cetera, if not domestic terror and violence that was perpetrated in the American South against Black people? The Black Code laws that that guaranteed they would have subpar economic and educational opportunities. What it meant that we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 to dismantle segregation, what it meant, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to guarantee universal access to the ballot, what it meant that in 1968, Martin Luther King died. So the next step, which would have been, I believe, well, first of all, he was already talking about militarism, getting out of his lane, which I think is a big reason, I believe, why he was assassinated. But also he was getting to the issue of the economic gap, the systemic economic gap that had never been closed, and that was a legacy of slavery. Remember, at the end of the Civil War, there had been the promise of 40 acres and a mule. There were, historians said there were between 4 and 5 million former slaves, formerly enslaved people. At the end of the Civil War, the promise from Tecumseh Sherman was that every former slave family of 4 would be given the 40 acres and a mule, which, as you can imagine, would have meant, okay, you're not only no longer a slave, but you have the tools that you
property owner that can vote.
That's right. Pardon?
Oh, I just meant a property owner that can now vote also.
Yeah, right. Well, we're years away from that, but we're just talking about how they're going to feed themselves.
Sure.
How they're going to feed their families. I mean, that 40 acres and a mule, they had been spending centuries tending other people's land. So they knew how to do it, right? Okay, so when I saw all that, and I began myself to have a clearer view of the timeline and of the journey of race in America, and also very aware that Germany, since World War II, has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations, which doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing psychological and emotional reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. And that war was over in 1945. Our war was over in 1865, and we are still just passing the baton of toxicity and pain from one generation to another. Now, I come from a background, my professional background is the field of universal spiritual principle. Well, you can't go forward in life. It's simply an issue of not only spiritual growth, but just any kind of personal growth. You cannot go forward in life until you've cleaned up the past. I think it was Faulkner who said the past isn't over. In fact, it's not past. So white America, as well as Black America, needs to complete the job. It wasn't, yes, I don't want to dishonor any of our ancestors, Black or white. The Civil War was not nothing. 600,000 people died. That institutionalized form of slavery, ending that, abolishing that, was no small deal. The Civil Rights Movement was no small deal. Passing the Voting Rights Act was no small deal. I'm not in any way diminishing what has occurred. It's just that not enough has occurred, and it's time for our generation to take the next step of this gaping wound, which is economic restitution.
Yeah,
and that's
I think
one
that's
of the reasons I ran for president, because I knew that the conversations that would be dominating the race were likely to not include the things that I believe are the most important things for us to think about and the most important things for us to do, i.e. peace creation, reparations for slavery, and also I had in my campaign, and have at least as much now, serious concern about millions and millions and millions of traumatized children in the United States and what it's going to mean for this country 10, 15, and 20 years from now.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I just think you spoke with the moral clarity on the subject that I don't think was really matched by any other candidate in the race on that issue. And just wanted to say thank you for bringing it. to the topic of discussion within the Democratic Party, at least, because I think it had been unfairly ignored until you kind of broached it. Again, not to discount the work of other people that have advocated for reparations, but you bringing it to the debate stage and on popular podcasts, like I mentioned, Dave Rubin, stuff like that. I think it did open people's eyes and hearts to the idea. I did have another question for you, Marianne, and something I've always thought was so interesting about your particular brand of politics and leftism. And personally, growing up in suburban Kansas, surrounded by the influence of evangelical Christianity in my neighborhoods and schools, my personal politics were really heavily informed as a reaction to what I saw as the influence of said religiosity on the culture around me, which of course was being manifested at the time largely by the movements against marriage equality, science, and of course abortion, which are still ever present in our society. And because of this, I've always had a little bit of an adverse reaction to any crossing of the church and state threshold. And I've always been put off by politicians on either side of the aisle that incorporate religion into their political messaging. But that being said, when you ran for president, I think that you were very, very successful in channeling what I would consider to be a genuinely Christian spirit, and that you were advocating for the rights of all of your neighbors and railing against the power structures of oppression, just like Jesus actually did and actually taught. What place do you see spirituality as having in your political philosophy or approach? And do you see yourself as part of a movement on the left to reclaim Christianity from the right, which is so thoroughly, undeniably co-opted both the Old and New Testament and twisted it for their own political and capitalistic gain?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be clear. Too many people are not clear about what this separation of church and state really is and why it was established and what the founders meant to be doing. When we were children, we all learned about how many people came to this country for religious freedom. So the idea that people could have the right to practice any religion here or no religion, which is also a large part of religious freedom. Any religion or no religion. Thomas Jefferson said, whether a man believes in 20 gods or no gods, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. That was in no way intended by the founders to keep the religious or spiritual conversation out of the public discourse. What separation of church and state means is that there's no minister, priest, imam, rabbi, monk, etc., can walk into the Capitol and say, as let's say the Ayatollah Khomeini could say in Iran, you can't pass that law, or you have to pass this law. They cannot interfere with the functions of government just because of their religious dogma. And it also means that no policeman is going to come into a synagogue, a Wicca meeting, an atheist meeting, or a Catholic church and say, break it up, you're not on the list. That's the importance of separation of church and state. JFK said we cannot afford to be materially rich and spiritually poor. It was Bobby Kennedy who first said, we're fighting for the soul of this country. And when I was growing up, when you and I were talking earlier about the Vietnam anti-war movement, there was a very vital religious left in America when I was growing up. There were the two priests, the Berrigan brothers. There was a man named William Sloane Coffin, who I believe was head of the Yale Divinity School, who were very, very active in the anti-war movement. Also, when I grew up, and you just said something, Gavin, about the Christian spirit, that is also the Jewish spirit, and I am a Jew, tikkun olam, to repair the world. The issues of spirituality are the universal spiritual themes that apply to all the great religious and spiritual systems. Now, also another thing that's interesting, when I was growing up, a strong social justice stance was taken by both Catholics and Jews. Simultaneously, it seems, two things happened which really sucked a lot of Jews out of the social justice movements. Both Catholics and Jews institutionally became very, very focused on single issues, the Catholics on abortion and the Jews on Israel. And when that happened, so until then, it was a big deal when you thought about caring for the poor, et cetera. We had Lyndon Johnson, remember, he had a war against poverty. right? So when I was growing up, there was a strong sense of religious institutions. And once again, talking about the Berrigan brothers were Catholic and William Sloane Coffin was Protestant, but you had a serious Protestantism. Now, I don't know where the break and why the break. And of course, let's not forget that Dr. King was a Baptist preacher. Hello. Nor should we forget that the abolitionist movement in the United States emerged from the early evangelicals in New Hampshire. Nor should we forget how many of the women who were leaders in the women's suffragette movement were Quakers and were basing their belief in radical equality on their religious beliefs, which also was threaded throughout the abolitionist movement. So when you look at the history of social justice movement in the United States, not only has it not been divorced or separated from spiritual impulse has driven it. And in many cases, it even emerged there. Once again, Dr. King's pulpit, right? Okay, so this break occurred. Why it occurred exactly the way it occurred, I don't understand myself, but it definitely occurred. And all of a sudden, democratic politics became, in my mind, deeply over-secularized. And an entire generation grew up with their only identification of religious principle with politics being far right-wing evangelicals.
Well, that would be Gavin and me.
Pardon?
Oh, that would be us. Yeah.
Now, the Jews weren't going there so much. The whole Israel thing was taking up a lot of that, just really ate up that space. The Catholics on an institutional level, the abortion thing, it took up that space. What happened to other Protestants? I don't know. You'll have to ask the Protestant, because for the life of me, I don't know what happened. But it went in a very almost apolitical direction in many cases. Now you have a profound voice for social justice from a religious figure, Reverend Barber, for whom I have tremendous admiration, affection, and respect. For me, like when I said that when I look at reparations, to me, it comes from a moral place. Catholics go to confession. Jews, the holiest day of the year is Yom Kippur, to atone. In Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a spiritual program, you have to admit the exact nature of your wrongs and your character defects. So for me, it is from a spiritual place why we need to pay reparations. You have to heal this, or it will always be an underlying toxicity. It is a spiritual principle to take care of the earth that is your home, proper stewardship of the earth. It is a spiritual principle to take care of one another. We are on this earth to love one another. So the Christian ethos, we are on the earth to love each other. The Tikkun Olam in Judaism, we are here to repair the world. In Islam, in so many religions, the idea of walk humbly with your God, do justice, do justice, do justice. Now, so that's where I'm coming from.
Sure.
But when you asked about the Democratic Party, this gets into what we talked about before. What does the cynic in me say? And what does the hopeful in me say? I was careful before this last election because I didn't want to say anything that might help somebody aid with their vote or non-vote the second term of Donald Trump. But now I think it needs to be said. Even when it comes to Black people, even when it comes to religion, you get the feeling that the Democratic Party is checking boxes and just adding to the mosaic of the identity politics. Maybe if we have this group and then we need to get this group and then we need to get this group, rather than the deeper conversations and understanding and dynamics that are necessary. First of all, to address the wounds, to address the brokenness, but also to create a real field of passionate politics that will be enough to keep the Trump forces at bay in the next 2, 4, 6 years, as well as create a new future trajectory for this country.
I also wanted to ask you a little bit. You mentioned before we started the Unity Temple here in Kansas City. Can you speak a little bit about the Unity religion and how that intersects with your own Judaism? I'm just interested to hear more about that.
I'm a student of a set of books called A Course in Miracles. A Course in Miracles is not a religion. There's no dogma. There's no doctrine. It's been referred to as a system of spiritual psychotherapy. It's really a psychological tome about forgiveness. That's really what it's about. It's about releasing a thought system based on fear and accepting instead a thought system based on love. Now, once again, I'm Jewish. Students of the Course in Miracles come from all religions and no religions. The Course in Miracles is a Christ-centered teaching, but it is not the Christian religion. There's no dogma, there's no doctrine, and it has certainly not in any way diminished my experience of my own Judaism. If anything, it's deepened it because it deepens my experience of God. The New Thought churches are a Christian denomination, the science of mind, religious science, unity, which have the more open-minded, although Christ-centered perspective. So you see a lot of people going to the New Thought churches from different religions, and there's great material there. In my career, speaking from as a student of the Course in Miracles, there were, and I believe are, many people in the New Thought movement who read A Course in Miracles. And so it was a very, and has been very hospitable to me in my career, including the Unity Temple in Kansas City. That's why I know it. I've spoken there quite a few times over the years. Duke Tufte, who's a great guy.
Yeah, I think that leads into, we want to be respectful of your time. The last question that I had for you today was, you've kind of talked about how you're putting a lot of your faith in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party right now to kind of resist the, the wing of war in Wall Street that we'll call the rest of the Democratic Party. I'm wondering if not through a People's Party taking an entirely different approach, but if we're going to, what does effective resistance look like from the squad, including Mondaire Jones and Jamal Bowman and these new actors, even though they are so severely constrained in how they can resist in the House with just the numbers that they're looking at, and also a Mitch McConnell death grip on any legislation passing in the Senate?
Once again, I am so admiring of AOC. I think she is, and I don't agree with her totally about everything. Mm-hmm. But I don't have to. I mean, that's not what politics is.
Sure.
But the space that she is holding is, in my mind, the answer to your question. She's in there. She's boring from within, but she refuses to be quiet. From day one, she's saying, no, Rahm Emanuel, no. Yeah. I have faith in what's possible, mainly because of her. And I know I interviewed Jamal Bowman on my Progressive Candidate Summit. And I know he's got the stuff. He's there for the right reason. I just also don't underestimate, and this is one of the reasons why I so admire Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's no way Nancy didn't say to her, here's my cell number, darling. Call me. There's no way she wasn't told, just toe the line and you'll be a big star. And she has refused. Now, on the other hand, her celebrity has given her that opportunity. So you and I are living this question right now. And I like the way Nick Brana of the People's Party says that when they run candidates in 22, they're only going to run candidates in safe Democratic districts. So I'm doing what everybody is doing. You guys seem to already have crossed the line into full-on support.
I actually voted for Joe Biden, specifically with the war in Yemen and the Iran sanctions in mind and those kinds of issues, though I for one, had no faith that he would, get behind Medicare for all or the Green New Deal. That's actually a disagreement that Gavin and I hashed out on the podcast.
So we'll see what happens. But we cannot afford to just go along, because if they just take that kind of a direction and do not create an FDR-like massive rescue economically of millions and millions of people. We've got 30 million people who are facing eviction. We've got millions of people who literally don't know how they're going to feed their children. The COVID package has been over $4 trillion, and only 1/5 of that went to actually helping individuals. If Biden does not come in with massive rescue regarding this huge amount of human suffering, whether it has to do with the removal of the college loan debts or anything else, then I believe we will have very serious consequences in 22 and in 24. And all of us, you and I think millions of other people, are just living the question right now. And for each of us, the answers will come.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And if the Democrats don't really get their act together, it's just going to continue opening the door to more faux populism on the right from characters like Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson or Josh Hawley or whoever else we have coming down the pipe. Tom Cotton. Yeah, just basically.
Or even Trump himself again.
Yeah, exactly.
His children.
Yeah, I think that the Democrats they need to wisen up and really do embrace, like you said, kind of New Deal style reforms. If we have a, prayer of stopping the, more working class rural communities from just completely exodus, into the Republican Party, into their, increasingly, honestly, somewhat masterful embrace of the, faux populism. Obviously, Donald Trump's out there talking about how he wants to end the wars and how he's battling the deep state and all this stuff that might sound appealing if you don't actually understand what a farce and what a con man he is and what his presidency has been. So thank you so much for, your clarity on this subject. I think you're one of the people that really has it right. And when it comes to MPP versus Democratic Party, I'm personally just kind of waiting to see what happens. I think like everyone, I'm not, my mind isn't 100% made up or anything. I think it depends on how the Democrats, conduct their nominating process in 2024. But I'm just, I'm really not excited to have to get behind, Andrew Cuomo or Kamala Harris or whatever that they're going to, retch up at us at the expense of an actual grassroots progressive candidate like someone like yourself who I really hope runs again, to be honest.
Thank you so much. I agree with you 100%. I feel the same way, and it's inspiring to me, as I'm sure it is to you as you do your podcast, just to see how many people are out there aligned in the same kind of thinking, the same kind of questioning, the same kind of enthusiasm and motivation to turn things around.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, Marianne. We had a great time, and just thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marianne. We hope to speak to you again at some point in the future. It was such an illuminating conversation, and continue to pay attention.
Fight the good fight.
And also, if anyone's listening, make sure to check out your Marianne Williamson's podcast, which is recent. She just had the great Nina Turner on. Amazing episode. Is there anywhere else people can check out, your stuff, your books, your work?
Yes, they can go to marianne.com, or I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. But that Twitter page has all my political stuff pretty much all day, every day.
Yeah, we're
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Marianne. Have a good rest of your day.
Links in the description for anyone that's watching. Thanks again, Marianne.